Investigators working for news agencies and Russian expatriates have blown the lid off Russia's gold smuggling operation in Sudan. The unassuming African nation has been locked in civil war for almost a century, and the Soviet Union capitalized on Sudan's instability to form a strong political alliance. As global sanctions threaten to collapse Russia's economy, shadow companies have started a smuggling operation to inject billions of dollars worth of gold into the Russian economy, while denying funds to war-torn Sudan. How did we get here? And how does Russia avoid sanctions by stealing Sudanese gold? Sudan's troubled past. Sudan is an ancient country with roots dating back to the Neolithic era. Inspired by the Egyptians to the north, Sudan's kingdom of Kush mirrored the pharaoh power structure, and the ancient city of Meroe erected pyramids of their own. By the 1500s, Sudan was introduced to Islam, and in the 1700s, an orthodox Islamic coup began to sway the country to Islam even further. Throughout the 1800s, Sudan was under siege by the Ottoman Empire, which started to divide Sudan into different regions. The most important of these regions today is the Darfur region to the west, which became a conflict zone again in recent years. Alongside Darfur, the northern and southern regions of Sudan also split up, which culminated in a long civil war as the Islamic North fought against the Christian and ancient religious groups of the south. Eventually, Britain and Egypt appointed a governor-general to rule Sudan as a colony of the British Crown. Shortly after Egypt obtained independence in 1952, the Sudanese people began their own push towards independence. By 1956, Egypt and Britain began a vote, and both the northern and southern Sudan regions could vote for independence. Although Sudan now had their first contemporary prime minister in Ismail al-Azahri, the Sudanese people kept the grudges from their past against countries like Egypt, Britain, and the former Ottoman-controlled countries. The hatred for these wars inflicted on Sudan still influences the country's international policy to this very day. Throughout the early to mid-1900s, Sudan maintained relationships with the United States and the Soviet Union. However, in 1967, the US declared their support for the Jewish Zionist movement that called for a new homeland for Jewish people in the Middle East after they were displaced by Nazi Germany. This movement would divide Palestine, and Israel became a recognized country. After the US backed Israel, Sudan cut ties with America and strengthened their connection with the Soviet Union. 2 years later, only 10 years after gaining independence, and Sudan was plunged into chaos as Colonel Jafar Mohammed al-Nimeri led a coup to overthrow the Sudanese government. In the middle of the night, Nimeri's companions captured generals of the Sudanese army to block strategic resistance. 3 hours later, at 7 a.m., Nimeri put out a broadcast announcing new members of the Council of Ministers and outlining his plans for the new government. The new government would be renamed the Democratic Republic of the Sudan. Even though the coup overturned the election process and the new administration was no longer a democracy. Instead, the new regime would be built on radical ideals borrowed from Soviet states, as private land was taken from the people, with the government gaining more control. It's even possible that Soviet intelligence forces stoked the flames of war, aiding the Sudanese coup d'etat to establish control over the country. A year later, at least 2,000 Soviet Union advisors were on the ground in Sudan to exert control over the region and broaden economic relations between Soviet nations and the African country. Sudan began exporting almost exclusively to the Soviet Union member nations. However, the Soviet intelligence agents overplayed their hand when members of the Sudanese Communist Party tried to assassinate Nimeri. This prompted a slight change of pace as Sudan tried to strengthen ties with NATO. As the USSR began supporting Ethiopia, Nimeri rejected the Soviets, just as he had done with the Americans. To further spite the USSR, Sudan supported the Afghan Mujahideen, who would spawn many of the world's worst terror groups. But in the end, in 1985, the Soviet Union destabilized Sudan once again with a military coup that overthrew Nimeri and brought Sudan back into the fold. Sudan and Russia have continued to strengthen their ties, with hundreds of Sudanese people studying abroad in Russia each year, the Soviet military, and Darfur. Throughout these rocky years for Sudan, the Darfur region wanted to return to their self-governing status they had back in the early days of Sudan's history. Land disputes broke out between nomadic groups and farms that stayed in one place. Religious majorities in Darfur were minorities in the wider context of Sudan, and they felt oppressed by the Islamic-controlled north. These disputes added to the constant unrest between the north and south, and eventually the Darfur region hit a breaking point. An ongoing water crisis hit the region as temperatures continued to rise and pollution degraded the environment. These factors created two rebel groups in Darfur, the Justice and Equality Movement and the Sudan Liberation Army, which would take on the Arabic Soviet-backed government of Sudan during the war in Darfur. The UN Council enacted an embargo on Darfur to prevent weapons from fanning the flames of war. Russia broke the embargo on Darfur by selling Antonov 26 transport planes, MiG-24 Hind attack helicopters, and other weapons for $21 million. These Russian-built war machines were used for genocide in the region, with communist militants slaughtering civilians instead of military combatants. Over time, Russian-bought arms would grow to account for 87% of Sudan's military force. Sudan's newly instated President Omar al-Bashir was accused of crimes against humanity and genocide, as sources estimate as many as 400,000 people died in Darfur. Sanctions and stealing gold. Russia began outwardly displaying their steps toward war back in 2014 after they seized Crimea from Ukraine. Sudan echoed support for Russia's annexation and voted against the UN General Assembly Resolution 68/262, which declared the Crimea secession vote was invalid. Beyond using Sudan as a puppet for further military expansion, Russia has an incentive to continue strengthening its relationship with Sudan, thanks to Sudan's economy. In 2010, Sudan was in the top 20 on the list of fastest-growing economies in the world. Initially, Sudan had a huge oil export industry, but that dried up when the South seceded and blocked access to most of Sudan's oil fields. However, oil still accounts for almost 20% of Sudan's exports, but their largest export today is gold. Gold accounts for 30% of Sudan's total exports, and Russia has their eyes set on Sudan's precious metals. When Sudan's economy was growing, Russia took a huge hit after their war in Ukraine sparked global economic sanctions. Prior to the war, Russia's gross domestic product was up 4.6%. But by 2022, Russia's GDP is estimated to have dropped to minus 11.2%, while imports and exports are down roughly 30% each. Russia's currency has been blocked by major banks as inflation rose by 22% in 2022 alone, with the rate expected to rise as Russia continues their war of aggression. To combat sanctions, fund their war effort, and strengthen the value of the Russian ruble, Russia has set its eyes on Sudan's gold. While the US decoupled their currency from gold in 1933, gold is still very valuable and easily convertible to paper currency. Compared to 2016, gold prices today are up roughly 61%. The gold mines of Sudan are unconventional compared to those of the US, with workers toiling under a sweltering hot desert sun in conditions akin to slave labor. In 2019, yet another coup took place, and Bashir was imprisoned. The transitional civilian government looked like a possible turn in Sudan's international relations, since the new Sudanese government was run by people who experienced the nightmares of Bashir, and these same people were aware that Russia is accused of perpetrating the same violence against Ukraine that Bashir inflicted. However, that same year, Sudan agreed to give Russia's navy access to Sudan's ports, and a year later, in 2020, Putin broke the news that the two nations would build a base along Sudan's Red Sea coast. In 2021, Another military coup silenced the pro-democracy movement thanks to Russia's support for rebels seeking a return to the days of Bashir. Abdel Fattah al-Burhan was appointed to the role of president after the coup. Major players in the newly formed Sudanese government, like commander of the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces Mohammed Dagalo, were in Moscow on the day Putin announced his invasion of Ukraine. Russia's connection to Sudanese gold is made even more obvious when digging into the life of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who owns M-Invest. M-Invest has multiple shell corporations, including Mero Gold, which is a slap in the face to the historical Sudanese city. Along with channeling gold from Sudan, M-Invest also trains and arms Sudan's paramilitary forces, which shows that Prigozhin is the leading figure enabling Russia to siphon gold to dodge sanctions. High-level Wagner Group commanders are also on the ground at Sudan's gold mines, controlling the operations and ensuring the gold goes straight to Russia, while the Sudanese people see none of the profits. Anti-corruption investigations in Sudan revealed the extent of Russia's gold smuggling operations just before the nation fell to Russian-backed militias last year. The airports in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, and those in the city of Port Sudan have been chartering flights to Syria, one of Russia's closest allies. Gold exports are also being ferried through the Central African Republic, which has ties to Russia's Wagner Group. In an attempt to conceal their ongoing gold smuggling efforts, the major players changed the name of their shell corporation to Al-Solag, though the change is transparent. In 2021 alone, 32.7 tons of gold went missing from Sudan, worth roughly $1.9 billion. Though other estimates approximate Russia is smuggling out 90% of Sudan's gold, which would be worth $13.4 billion. The ongoing war in Ukraine is proving to be a worldwide crisis situation as Russia squeezes poor countries like Sudan to funnel their most valuable economic asset. Russia's gold smuggling operation in Sudan threatens to undo the economic pressure placed on them by most of the world, and if Russia's economic sanctions fail, that will only embolden them to carry on their war of aggression. Did you know about Russia's gold smuggling operation? Let us know in the comments section below, and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on the latest geopolitical headlines.